Yo, everyone. Chris said that if I keep making videos, I don't have to go back in the basement, so I'm back. And today we're talking about the 1991 Russian coup attempt. So let's paint the picture. It's 1995, and General Secretary Gorbachev is beginning a massive restructuring effort in the Soviet Union with economic, political, and cultural reforms. His goal was to decentralize much of the state-run economy, relax some policies towards censorship and restrictions on freedom of speech, while moving away from a single-party communist rule, allowing for a bit more democratization. The USSR in the late 80s was entering a time of crisis. There were food shortages, fuel shortages, factories couldn't pay their workers, and inflation was upwards of 300% per year. In 1990, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Armenia had declared their independence from the Soviet Union, sparking the January events, which were a violent crackdown on the nationalist uprisings in Lithuania, and similar events by pro-Soviet groups to overthrow the Latvian government, which they saw as too westward-leaning and didn't want to break off from the Soviet Union. This, of course, just sparked other nationalist movements in places like Ukraine and Georgia looking to separate themselves from the USSR. By all accounts, the Soviet Union was starting to collapse. Of course, the Soviets who held strong political positions in the government were not too happy about the sudden loss of power, and planning to overthrow Gorbachev began in September of 1990. The planned coup was headed by 4 different organizations: the State Committee on the State of Emergency, Communist Party hardliners, several units inside the Soviet military, and of course, the KGB secret police. The State Committee on the State of Emergency was the main organization established by the coup plotters to seize power during the coup attempt. It was composed of high-ranking officials within the Communist Party government and the security apparatus who opposed Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms. The committee was led by hardline party members such as Gennady Yanayev, the vice president of the Soviet Union at the time, and included other prominent figures such as Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov and KGB chief Vladimir Khrushchev. The group was formed after the January events with the idea that Gorbachev would declare a state of emergency, which would then allow them an opening to just seize power permanently. While the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had been experiencing internal divisions, particularly between reformist and hardline factions, the coup attempt was primarily orchestrated by hardline elements within the party who opposed Gorbachev's policies, reforms, and transparency. They believed that Gorbachev's reforms were leading to the disintegration of the Soviet Union and sought to preserve the communist system already in place. Within the military, several high-ranking military officials were involved in the coup planning, including Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov and Chief of the Soviet General Staff Valentin Varnenikov. The military is planning to play a crucial role in the impending coup, with troops being deployed to key locations inside of Moscow to enforce martial law and suppress any potential opposition with violence if needed. Finally, the KGB, under the leadership of Chairman Vladimir Khrushchev, was responsible for monitoring and suppressing dissent, and included efforts to control media outlets and communication channels to prevent opposition from organizing. The KGB, doing what the KGB does, placed Gorbachev under heavy surveillance, labeling him Subject 110, and placed bugs everywhere the General Secretary would go, while monitoring his conversations closely. In June of 1991, the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, Jack F. Matlock Jr., was informed that a coup was being planned. He then directly warned Gorbachev, but the General Secretary assumed that the threat was from lower levels of the government, not from his own cabinet, and jokingly announced the coup was over when members of the State Emergency Committee asked for additional authority, which was eventually denied. A month later in July, an open letter titled A Word to the People, signed by 12 prominent Soviet figures, was published in a state-run newspaper. It heavily criticized Gorbachev and the Soviet President Boris Yeltsin, saying that something had to be done to prevent total collapse of the Soviet Union, and that the Communist Party members had to step up to prevent it from happening. An enormous unforeseen calamity has taken place, motherland. Our land, a great power given to us to ward with nature, glorious ancestors, it is perishing, breaking apart, falling into darkness and non-being, and this collapse takes place at our silence, toleration, and accord. Let us unite so as to stop the chain reaction of the disastrous collapse of the state, economy, human personality, in order to contribute to the strengthening of the Soviet power, to the transformation of it into a genuinely people's power, and not some manger for the hungry nouveau riches. Nouveau riches, I like that. Who are ready to sell off everything for the sake of their insatiable appetite. Soviet Union, this is our home and stronghold, built with enormous efforts of all the peoples and nations, that has saved us from disgrace and slavery at the times of hideous invasions. Russia, unique, beloved, she is crying for help. After the publication of this letter, Gorbachev and Yeltsin discussed placing these hardlining communist members with more liberal-leaning heads, as well as replacing the KGB head with someone else and putting him in a position of less power. Yeltsin, taking the coup a bit more seriously than his peers, established a secret defense committee, ordering KGB commanders to stay loyal to the ruling party party. Finally, he established a reserve government in the city of Sverdlovsk, which would serve as a pseudo-government in exile in the case that Moscow fell to a coup, and they would work to take it back. A hidden microphone placed by Gorbachev's own bodyguard recorded the entire conversation, and the bodyguard then went to go report the entire thing to the KGB. They realized it was now or never if they were going to actually do this coup. On the 4th of August, Gorbachev left for a vacation in Crimea and planned to return to Moscow on August 20th in order to sign the new Union Treaty, which would salvage what was left of the USSR and eventually implement the more liberal policies that had been in the works until then. On August 17th, members of the coup met in Moscow to discuss the document, which would have stripped them of almost all their ruling authority and made their final preparations. Their plan was to declare a state of emergency just prior to Gorbachev's return and force him to resign, giving power over to Vice President Yenev, while General Secretary Pavel Grechev, commander of the Soviet airborne forces, along with the KGB, would declare martial law. The next day, communications from Gorbachev and his Crimean vacation home were cut, and members of the KGB entered his building, demanding he hand over power and restore order to the country. The immediate reaction by Gorbachev is debated, with him claiming that he outright refused the ultimatum, but KGB members claimed he said, "Damn you, do what you want, but report my opinion." What isn't up for debate, though, is that what followed was several minutes of very clever insulting by both parties that, if I repeated here, would just get me demonetized, but you can use your imagination. Ultimately, the KGB held Gorbachev in his vacation home, not allowing him to leave and cutting the house off from the outside by force. It was decided that the official story would say that Gorbachev had fallen dangerously ill and that the vice president had to step up in order to take over power, which he then signed immediately as a decree. In a very Russian move, they then ordered 250,000 sets of handcuffs to be manufactured at a factory near Moscow, and 300,000 arrest forms printed up and just ready to go. They also emptied the Lefortovo prison in order to prepare it for a wave of new arrests. On Monday, August 19th, 1991, Resolution Number 1 was signed, declaring a state of emergency to last at least 6 months, which prohibited rallies, protests, strikes, and set aside a nice 1,500 square meter block for personal use to any interested Moscow residents. Just ignore the stacks of armed guards and handcuffs next to it, nothing to see here. By 6 in the morning, the declaration was made over the state-run radio and television broadcasts, and all independent broadcasters were shut down. At the time, plans were made to seize President Yeltsin as he returned from Kazakhstan, but he called for a last-second flight redirection, and they were unable to get to him in time after he landed. A Spetsnaz group was sent to arrest him in his home near Moscow, but for still unknown reasons, they let him go. Some accounts say that the Spetsnaz commander simply refused the order once on the ground, but this has been questioned by historians. But ultimately, this failure to arrest him would prove fatal to the entire coup. The president began inviting prominent loyal government members to his home, who all then traveled to the White House. That's what they call their parliament building. It's not the one where, Uncle Joe lives. He then issued a declaration to the citizens of Russia that called out the coup for what it was, and for citizens and members of government to stay loyal to the sitting party. He then officially took command of all Soviet military and security personnel in order to prevent the breakout of a full-on civil war. The population on this was divided by all accounts. About 24% of the population supported it in Moscow, while other polls showed a huge majority of the people fearing a return of a totalitarian Russian state. Protests backing Gorbachev began gathering, while the leaders of the coup and the sitting Russian government held press conferences. It was noted that the coup leaders in their speeches appeared either drunk or scared, and the open broadcasts helped portray that the coup leaders might have been more incompetent than others were thinking. The Soviet military forces brought into Moscow to assist in the coup began defecting at mass rates and refusing orders to shoot protesting civilians. Yeltsin urged the protesters not to harass the soldiers, and that if any of the troops defected away from the coup, they would be given full amnesty. Major Evdemikov, chief of staff of a nearby tank battalion guarding the White House, declared loyalty to the Russian government, and Yeltsin was able to address the crowd on top of one of his tanks. To stop the defections, the coup leaders confined soldiers to their barracks, but this only made it harder to enforce the government overthrow because they had less people available to actually do it. The next day, the Soviet General Staff, working to overthrow the government, ordered that the Shiget briefcase that held the nuclear launch codes to be returned to Moscow. However, those in charge of actually conducting any nuclear attack, the Soviet Air Forces, Navy, and Strategic Rocket Forces, declared that they would not follow any orders from those involved in the coup. At noon on the 20th, the Moscow military district, under control of the coup, was told to enforce a curfew in Moscow from 11 p.m. to 5 a.m., and this was taken as a sign that the White House holding the president and other loyal Russian government members would be attacked. Loyalist groups formed makeshift defenses around the White House, though most of those defending were completely unarmed. In the afternoon, the decision to attack was made, codenamed Operation Grom, which is Russian for Thunder. It included elements of the elite Alpha Group and Vimpel Special Forces, paratroopers, paramilitary police forces, 3 tank companies, and a helicopter squadron. Commanders of these groups began intermingling with the massive crowds around the buildings and reported that this operation would lead to a complete civilian bloodshed and should just be completely canceled. Airborne Commander General Alexander Lebed, with consent of the other commanders, secretly informed those in the White House that the attack would commence at 2 in the morning the following day. At around 1 in the morning, an hour prior to the attack, trolley buses and street cleaning trucks were used to barricade tunnels leading to the White House in order to block IFVs from the Taman guards from entering, and these were under the command of Captain Sergei Surovikin, who you might know as the commander of the Russian forces in Ukraine in 2022. Something time is a flat circle. 3 people would end up being killed in the subsequent clash, which shocked the troops in the area. The immediate realization that the 3 were only the start of what would be a complete massacre caused the military commanders staging the attack on the White House to call off the offensive and pull out of Moscow. By 8 in the morning, it was clear the coup had already failed. Members of the Emergency Power Committee, now panicking, attempted to meet with Gorbachev still under house arrest in Crimea, but were delayed getting there by a traffic jam caused by all the military forces returning to their bases away from Moscow. By 4 p.m., the Soviet parliament adopted a resolution declaring the actions of the Emergency Powers Committee to be completely illegal and that any legal actions they signed into effect were now null and void. As the members of the coup arrived in Crimea to meet with the General Secretary, they were blocked by 36 members of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, armed with machine guns, and Gorbachev refused to meet with them. By 10 p.m., an arrest warrant was signed for all members of the Emergency Powers Committee, many of whom didn't even make it off the tarmac before being placed into handcuffs. The aftermath of the failed coup attempt helped spur the already snowballing effects of the USSR's breakup, with each of the republics eventually declaring their independence. And finally, on Christmas Day, just a few months after the ill-fated coup, Gorbachev resigned and the Soviet Union was no more. It should also be noted that during the coup, members of the people trying to overthrow the government were drunk at any given moment and had to be kept in their homes before they did something really stupid, which obviously isn't going to help your cause if you're trying to overthrow a world power. I'm throwing this in at the end though, because if I had listed in the timeline every single time that it happened, this video would be probably over 3 hours long. That's the story of the 1991 Soviet coup attempt. I hope you liked it. Leave down in the comments what you want to see next, and if you like this topic, if you want me to do something differently, I'm all for it. I just don't want to go back in the basement. I'm Justin Taylor with Task of Purpose First Squad. Thanks for watching, and I will see you again very soon in the next one.